I have a certain weakness for Hegel, said Karl Barth in 1953, and I'm always fond of doing a little bit of Hegeling. In this lecture I want to consider what it might mean to do a bit of Hegeling. In my experience, it's not possible to do a bit. Engaging Hegel is an undertaking that requires strenuous preparation, a certain apprenticeship even. But first we must ask, who are these figures and how did they clash? G.W.F. Hegel was born in 1770, the same year as Beethoven, and finished his varied career at the relatively new University of Berlin, where he had held a chair in philosophy from 1818, appointed when he was 48 years old. The University of Berlin, now Humboldt University, had been founded 7 years earlier, with a faculty of philosophy which was unusually and intentionally separate and independent from and of the faculty of theology. His major work after his appointment there, the last appointment he took, was his Elements of the Philosophy of Right, published in 1820, although he continued to revise his previous works, including his Science of Logic and his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. He developed new lecture courses, including, importantly for us this evening, lectures on the philosophy of religion. He delivered these between 1821 and 1831, the year of his death. Hegel did not publish these. In fact, he published no books in the last 10 years of his life, but lecture notes from those who attended were gathered, edited and published, and we have a good sense of what those lectures contained. Hegel's intellectual interests, like many philosophers of that time, were typically broad. He wrote on questions of metaphysics, ethics, logic, law, the natural sciences, religion, politics, aesthetics, the history of philosophy, and on the concept of history itself. Karl Barth was born over 100 years later in Basel in 1886, a few months before the composer Nadia Boulanger, and the same year as the sculptor Jean Arp. He held professorships in Germany, in Göttingen, Münster and Bonn between 1921 and 1935, between the ages of 35 and 49, at which point he was forced to resign his post because he refused to swear an oath to Chancellor Hitler. He was swiftly appointed Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Basel and remained there for the last 27 years of his career until his retirement in 1962 at the age of 75. He published a vast oeuvre, most notably the Church Dogmatics, an unfinished masterpiece in 13 volumes. We are interested this evening in the periods when these two figures each held professorships at the starts of what we might call their mature careers, when Hegel was lecturing his course in the philosophy of religion in Berlin in his mid-50s, and Barth was delivering lectures on major German figures, including Hegel, in Bonn in his late 40s. Both were written during periods of political turmoil. Hegel had completed his Phenomenology of Spirit in 1806 in Jena during the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, in which the Prussian armies were decisively defeated by Napoleon. It's common to remember Hegel's description in a letter to a friend of his impression of Napoleon just before the battle. I saw the emperor, this world spirit, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. This extraordinary man, whom it is impossible not to admire. And such a lofty view at a cosmic scale should not distract us from attention to ordinary life at a local level. Hegel was at that time an extraordinary professor in Jena, which sounds wonderful. It means he was unsalaried. And he suffered firsthand the catastrophic effects of the badly organised feudal Prussian state, facing an efficient modern adversary with a streamlined chain of command. He was financially dependent on student enrolments, and of course, these collapsed in the after effects of that battle. During Hegel's later career, what would later become Germany eventually began undergoing a rapid political development in the wake of the French Revolution over 30 years earlier, and then the defeat of Napoleon in 1814. Hegel's philosophy of right, with its concern with authority, law, and the principles which govern the state, was composed against the backdrop of these attempts at modernization and reform. These reforms were slow in coming, however, and in the year before Hegel's death, there were riots in Berlin. Barth's theology was formed against the backdrop of the Great War and the proud support of many of Germany's senior theologians for Germany and its military action. The Manifesto of the 93 was a proclamation signed by well-known figures in the arts and sciences supporting that war aggression, and it included several theologians, including the church historian Adolf Harnack and Wilhelm Hermann, one of Barth's teachers, as well as several figures that are now part of our cultural intellectual furniture, including Ernst Haeckel, stem cells, Engelbert Humperdinck, Hansel and Gretel, Felix Klein, non-Euclidean geometry, Max Klinger, a sculptor whose girl bathing you can see in the Birmingham Museum of Art here in town, Max Planck, quantum theory, and Wilhelm Windelband, now remembered for the terms nomothetic and ideographic. For Barth and many others of his generation, this complicity between intellectual life in universities and German militarism was a stark sign that another reformation was needed. Barth's theology was thus developed as a set of alternatives to state violence backed by religion. He was a theology professor in Göttingen and Münster during the Weimar Republic, and then professor in Bonn, when in the wake of the financial crisis of 1929, the National Socialists became the largest party in the federal election in the July 1932 elections, followed shortly by Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January of 1933. Universities quickly became the focus of book burnings, and university professors faced a stark choice over whether to affirm their allegiance to the state or be forced out. Barth was a key figure in the publication of the Barmen Declaration in 1934, a document denouncing subordination of the church to the state. He had to leave Bonn the following year and returned to his native Switzerland, where he continued his project of the Church Dogmatics, which he had begun in the same year that the Nazis won their first elections. Church Dogmatics is a sustained attempt to develop fundamental categories out of Scripture and the long Christian tradition, rather than out of modern philosophy and common sense cultural life. These are our two figures. Barth was lecturing on Hegel in Bonn in the early 1930s, just before he was forced out. He published a long essay, it's much longer than any lecture could be, in 1947, with a corrected version in 1952. It appeared in a volume entitled Protestant Theology in the 19th Century, Its Background and History. Hegel is one of the several figures in the Vorgeschichte backstory section, which treats Rousseau, Lessing, Kant, Herder, Novalis, and finally Hegel. The work then turns to theologians, starting with Schleiermacher. It's an intellectual story, and Hegel comes at the end of it. And the Hegel essay is, as I said, long, 35 pages of small print in the German, interrupted only by a single high-quality plate, a portrait of Hegel by an unknown artist with suitably wide eyes. English translations, I'm afraid, offer no such relief. The original Swiss publishers, by contrast, spared no expense. So who was Hegel for Barth? Barth begins this essay, the focus of our discussion this evening, with a puzzle. Why was Hegel's thought so quickly abandoned after his death, given the considerable power of its vision? Barth distinguishes two questions. First, why was Hegel abandoned in the mid-1800s? And second, why is the current, that's to say in the early 1930s, so-called Hegel Renaissance, such an underwhelming affair? This, he says, is astonishing. Barth advances 5 Hegelian theses, posed originally as rhetorical questions. First, Hegel rejoices in reason and history free of all of the ties of tradition. He exploited Kant's discovery of the transcendent nature of the human capacity to reason. He realized the goal of attempting to oppose Kant's real or supposed one-sidedness. He was a great systematizer of the romantic immediacy of creative individuality and the dialectic of the way this individual's life moves. And last, he came as the fulfiller of every promise that he inherited. Barth notes the extraordinary popularity of Hegel's philosophy in Berlin during the 1820s. Barth was fairly knowledgeable and knew that Hegel was an absolutely appalling lecturer who absolutely packed lecture theatres. Well, why was he so popular? Because, Barth says, surely Hegel embodied the spirit of that age. And it also follows that the rejection that followed Hegel's death was that later age's refusal or denial of itself, of its own spirit. Barth is particularly interested in the later period from the 1880s onwards. For him it is a meaner, stingier world, where a boom in the natural and historical sciences had tended to turn scholars less into the living transmission of a tradition and more into stock takers and accountants with no living relation to the past. What Gadamer would later call Wirkungsgeschichte, the past acting on and shaping the present, became just Geschichte, history, a display in a museum, under glass, inert. In Barth's words, it was somehow resigned. And this, he says, and this resignation began to lay itself like a paralyzing spell upon all intellectual life. There is thus for Barth a noticeable contrast between the outward pomp of Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, that is from 1888 onwards after Wilhelm became emperor, and the small-mindedness of its intellectual life. Again, in Barth's words, the century had become tired and somehow sad for all its enforced jollity. But Hegel is not the hero of this account. Barth is troubled by Nazism and the Deutsche Christen in the 1930s when it was written, and troubled by the aftermath of the war in 1947 when this essay was published. He's troubled by Hegel's supreme confidence, a confidence Barth does not share and urges his reader not to share either. Hegel, for Barth, is confident in the power of thought. Hegel is self-confident. He is confident about philosophy's all-embracing capacity. He is especially confident that God can be understood, rendered intelligible, conceptualized. For Hegel, as Barth interprets him, philosophy embraces everything, including theology. Hegel is the voice of modern man, who understands everything and who has considered all objections and has answered them in advance, for whom confidence in God is confidence in himself, and for whom to listen to Hegel's God is, and I quote, to hear the loveliest and deepest echo of his own voice. So here is Barth. The identity which exists between our thinking and what is thought, insofar as it is achieved in the act of thinking, is, with Hegel, called spirit. So Hegel's brand of self-confidence is also confidence in spirit, which for its own part is one with God and the same with God. It is Titanism to the highest degree, and at the same time to the highest degree of humility. The self-confidence it proclaims is at once and as such confidence in God. Here then is the fundamental contradiction. Hegel says he is talking about God, but Barth worries that in fact Hegel is talking about Prussian self-consciousness. Hegel presents his work with the utmost humility as a concern with God, but this humility is but a cover for supreme self-confidence. For those with a keen ear in the history of ideas, this is pure Feuerbach from The Essence of Christianity in 1841, published 10 years after Hegel's death, a text which Barth knew very well indeed. Well, the chief exhibit in this display of self-confidence is the concept in Hegel. Everything now turns on how Barth interprets it. And it is for Barth a surprisingly simple matter. Hegel's understanding of the concept is the unity of thinking and being. The relationship between thinking and being, between how we think things are and how they are, is one of the classic puzzles in philosophy, because after all, on the one hand, there is no getting around our thinking. It is ever present. We have no relation to the world except in our thinking. But on the other hand, we know we are often wrong, sometimes horribly wrong. Just because we think it doesn't make it so. Barth thinks that Hegel has this relationship between thinking and being badly wrong. Hegel makes, he thinks, several errors, all stemming ultimately from this first one. So, Hegel's 4 errors. Hegel's first error, for Barth, is to suppose there is an identity between thinking and what is thought. In Hegel's philosophy, what I am thinking and what I am thinking about are the same. The second error is like, namely this: all reality is contained in the concept. The concept bestrides everything and includes everything in itself. The third error is that because of this all-encompassing power of the concept, all contradictions are absorbed and annulled by the concept. Barth is particularly troubled, that Hegel not only says this explicitly, he seems even to celebrate this quality of the concept. Fourth error is inconsistency. Hegel uses various technical terms, that is an understatement, but he makes the mistake, Barth says, of allowing them to bleed into each other. They overlap. Hegel wholly fails to keep them distinct, quite unlike, Barth says, the admirable philosophy textbooks that he is familiar with. Hegel is woefully loose with his terms. This is the case for the prosecution, but does not, in fairness, end on an entirely critical note. He commends Hegel for taking knowledge of God seriously, for taking history seriously, for wanting to overcome contradictions. Barth also commends Hegel for challenging theology, for tendencies to cavil about whether there can be knowledge of God, for its tendency sometimes to make abstract claims not anchored in history, for its willingness on occasion to allow its claims to be reduced to materialism, to science, or whatever. Nonetheless, the rejection of Hegel is decisive. And what are we to make of this comprehensive and crushing critique? We face three problems. The first is that this critique is deeply influential in the field of theology. There are quite literally hundreds of theologians, some of whom listening to this lecture on podcast, whose only perspective on Hegel comes from Barth's essay, either directly or indirectly. It is not going to be an easy matter to shift this heavy weight of presumption against Hegel. The second is that Hegel's work is not easy to read. Hegel has many fine qualities as a thinker, but he is not a great writer. His terminology is obscure, his approach is often oblique, and one can quickly get bogged down explaining jargon. The third is that many defences of Hegel are, to put it bluntly, as opaque as the original. Worse, much worse, many defences of Hegel co-opt him for a particular late 20th century vision of liberal theology, liberal in a very strong sense, which tends to confirm more traditional figures in their prejudice against Hegel. If Hegel does not repel his theological readers, his defenders often manage it quite well for him. This, then, is going to be for us a strategy of the courtroom. The case for the prosecution has been made. I certainly want to give Hegel a reply to Barth. He deserves one. But I'm reluctant to put him straight in the witness box and have him speak in his own words. His vocabulary and his bold claims will very likely work in the prosecution's favour. Hegel is quite possibly a hostile witness at his own trial, if only because of the time we would need to disentangle his prose. And whilst I have great confidence that we could do that, I don't think that is good use of our limited time. But there is, I'm glad to say, a better option. Let us immediately recall Barth and consider the charges one by one. To do this, we need a skilled philosophical defender who understands Hegel, but also has a certain historical sympathy for Barth and grasps at a deep level why he might approach things the way he does. I propose to call to the stand the English philosopher R.G. Collingwood and have him conduct the defence. Collingwood was an almost exact contemporary of Barth, just 3 years younger, and his relevant major work on philosophical method was published at almost exactly the time Barth was lecturing on Hegel. It's a variation of a matter of months. And we will not, however, concern ourselves with Collingwood's biographical details. His sole function here is as a barrister conducting a defence. And so, with Collingwood as our guide, we shall take up Barth's 4 errors. The first error, the identity between thinking and being. This is clearly a matter of what is meant by identity. If one means, as in ordinary language we would, that they are the same, then Hegel is clearly in the wrong. Thinking and being are not the same, and we know this from the simple fact that our thinking is often mistaken. It is better to say that for Hegel, thinking and being are a unity. This is so in 2 ways. Our thinking is a product of social life. Can there be a more concrete expression of being than that? But anything we say about being is thought. There is no way to get outside thinking, to compare the relation of our thinking to being. There is no place we could occupy. Thinking and being are thus identical in a rather limited sense, and in fact in a way that is not compatible with common sense uses of the term. So the first argument in the defence is that when Hegel says something is identical, he is not using this term in a common sense way. If we attempt to interpret Hegel using common sense terms, we will misunderstand him, and we will misunderstand him catastrophically. All reality is encompassed within the concept. Well, Collingwood says, concepts have two kinds of uses. An everyday use, which is perfectly suitable, and a philosophical use, which is restricted and technical. In everyday use, concepts are distinct and opposed. Yesterday was a warm day, today is a cold day. In philosophical use, however, concepts embrace all degrees of difference. For example, the concept of heat embraces everything on the scale of hotness, including encompassing warm and cold. Hegel's concept describes this philosophical use. Again, everyday language, everyday uses, perfectly respectable and normal ways of going about things, are going to be misleading if we're to interpret what Hegel is doing. Third, the concept annuls all contradictions. Before going to Collingwood's defence, let me explain briefly why this is a particular concern for Barth. This is a theologian who sees the prime role of the intellectual, especially in Germany at this time, of contradicting the majority opinion, of contradicting false claims, contradicting lies. So a philosophy which annuls all contradictions is particularly pernicious and problematic. What might Collingwood have to say to this? In everyday use, concepts frequently contradict and oppose each other. A hot bath is opposed to a cold bath. In philosophical usage, concepts embrace all such contradictions. The concept of heat in philosophical uses embraces hot and cold with respect to baths. The contradiction between hot and cold is, we might say, annulled. Note, this has no effect on whether your bath is hot or cold, and cannot annul the contradiction of expecting a hot bath but climbing into a cold one. The philosophical concept of heat may annul the contradiction between hot and cold, but it would be a foolish philosopher and not a Hegelian philosopher at all, who thereby chooses not to wrap up when it is snowing. Fourth, technical terms are not kept distinct, they constantly overlap. This is the charge of inconsistency. Well, Collingwood would say, Barth is quite right. In everyday use, concepts are distinct and do not overlap. The genus Panthera includes, among many, the species puma and lynx. They are distinct and they do not overlap. Concepts used philosophically do overlap. For example, it is common in philosophy to consider the genus judgment and to distinguish within it the species good, true, and beautiful. It's quite a proper thing for philosophers to judge things to be good, true, and beautiful. But crucially, these species do not exclude each other. They're not like puma and lynx. They overlap. Something can be judged to be good and beautiful, even though good and beautiful are distinct species of judgment. Hegel is concerned and reflects upon such philosophical matters. Hegel's terms do overlap, Barth is right, but only when they are used philosophically, only in these cases. It is not a sign of his lack of consistency, but, on the contrary, a mark of his considerable logical sophistication. We can at this point thank Professor Collingwood for his service and adjourn to consider our verdict. It is plain that Barth is not simply wrong about Hegel. He does not make false claims about him. He makes true claims, but does not grasp their significance. Barth claims quite reasonably that Hegel uses concepts to assert the identity of thinking and being, to encompass entire scales within a concept, to annul all contradictions within a concept, and he frequently permits his concepts to overlap. We cannot simply say to Barth, "Oh no, mate, you got Hegel completely wrong." He has, in a certain way, got Hegel right. Barth grasps that what Hegel is doing differs from the philosophy textbooks with which he is familiar, so we can briefly review. For Barth, Hegel's concept first asserts an identity of thinking and being, check. It encompasses entire scales, check, like the scale of heat, for example. It annuls contradictions, hot and cold baths, check, and there is frequent overlap between concepts. So what has Barth to say about our discovery that Hegel's common sense vices are, in fact, when properly understood and interpreted, philosophical virtues? At this point, our peaceful visit to the realm of philosophical logic must be interrupted by the harsh realities of Barth's home life. We cannot allow ourselves to think about Barth's work, not even something as majestically exalted as his relation to Hegel, without acknowledging its costs, for they are severe. Something was badly missing in my short summary of Barth's life at the start of this lecture. This is an image of Charlotte von Kirschbaum and Karl Barth from roughly the time that the Hegel essay was written. They are both writing it. Their relationship, Charlotte von Kirschbaum and Barth, has been a topic of discussion and speculation for many years, with a strict division between those who personally knew the Barth family and its situation, and those, like us, who did not. And I am surely not alone in having had many conversations with older professors in Germany, which are frank and unvarnished, but which all end. But this we can never say in public. The period of secrets and rumour is now over, with the publication in 2008 of intimate letters between them, and this year in July, the publication of a clear-eyed, unsentimental assessment by Professor Christiane Tietz, Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Zurich. Enough is now public that silence is no longer a respectable option. Karl Barth and Charlotte von Kirschbaum met in 1925. Barth had been married to Nelly since 1913. Karl and Charlotte immediately fell in love. Von Kirschbaum, 11 years Barth's junior, became what Barth called his secretary, but she was in fact his research assistant, lover, and from 1929 she lived in the Barth household, with the three of them, Nelly, Charlotte, and Karl, in what he called a Notgemeinschaft zu dritt, something ambiguous in German, as Tietz points out. One can translate it, Notgemeinschaft, either as a union of necessity or a union of trouble. it was awful for all three. Nellie begged Karl to be faithful to her and to her marriage. Karl asked Nellie for a divorce, and then, when she agreed, refused it. And Charlotta, for her part, acknowledged that she did not treat Nellie as she should. There are some troubling aspects to this relationship beyond the relationship itself. The voices of the women, of Nellie and Charlotta, are eclipsed, as so often. Karl's letters are available to us, but many of our Charlotta's were destroyed, probably by Karl, and Nellie's correspondence is also patchy. It also appears, in Tietze's analysis, that both Nellie and Charlotta each at various times expressed severe anger, even rage, at Karl, and he rebuked them for what he called their hysterics and threatened not to engage with them. Karl preferred his women to suffer quietly. Charlotta was furthermore not paid a salary. She received from him a monthly allowance, and she was never credited properly in publications. Well, out of respect, let us return to these figures, their last names, and consider this question's relevance for our discussion. Von Kirschbaum was intimately involved with Barth's research and writing until disease, probably Alzheimer's, meant she had to move into a home. The period when Barth was lecturing on Hegel in Bonn was exactly the period when the relationship with Charlotta was settling into a routine. And we cannot say how much of this essay is Barth and how much is von Kirschbaum. It's not because we lack evidence, but because their working relationship was so intimate. The essay we have is not jointly authored. Barth, as I said, would introduce von Kirschbaum as his secretary in order to avoid scandal. And his book carries the man's name alone. But it was certainly jointly written, jointly drafted, and jointly corrected. We are obligated to acknowledge this publicly. So our clash of the titans is much messier than one might think. It's no longer a matter of two great men wrestling in their greatness, a macho fantasy in any case, but of two thinkers grappling hard with a third. So our problem is the problem of how to interpret Barth's and von Kirschbaum's critique of Hegel. So Barth and von Kirschbaum are right about what Hegel does, but they are wrong about how to assess it. Barth and von Kirschbaum, we need to get used to saying that, believe that Hegel claims infinite knowledge. There is no limitation or exaggeration, no folly or wickedness in the whole range of human thinking which would not be in principle included in the rational quality of the concept which conceives all reality within itself. That's a direct quotation. This is theologically catastrophic for the theologians. It means that the all-powerful, all-knowing philosopher, who, incidentally, rather resembles certain conceptions of God, although Barth and von Kirschbaum do not say this directly, this philosopher has a total perspective on everything, and they mock Hegel for casting, and I quote, a key to open every lock, a lever to set every wheel working at once, an observation tower, from which not only all the lands of the earth, but the third and seventh heavens too, can be surveyed at a glance. Well, Hegel does indeed claim infinite knowledge, but as we saw in Collingwood's defence, this is not quite as exciting as Barth and von Kirschbaum mean, or at least not exciting in the way they think. I admit, I find it pretty exciting, but then I'm excited by questions of logic. Barth's and von Kirschbaum's theological concerns can be disentangled from his understandings of Hegel, and this is worthwhile because Barth's and von Kirschbaum's theological concerns surely remain ours if we are theologians. or they ought to. Barth and von Kirschbaum insist that there are three focal concepts used of God in theology that must not be dissolved in any sense. God's sovereignty must not be dissolved in such a way that God becomes imprisoned in human language. God's freedom must not be dissolved in such a way that God's actions become understood as necessary. And God's grace must not be dissolved in such a way that it is lost in a humanly specified logic. These are, I think, good theological principles, and I believe any Christian theologian should assent to them. Barth and von Kirschbaum assent to them. I certainly assent to them. The question is whether Hegel needs to be corrected by them. I do not think he does. This is because Barth and von Kirschbaum and Hegel are asking different questions. Hegel asks a set of logical questions. These are questions about the function of concepts when they are used philosophically, as opposed to their use in everyday common sense systems of classification. Hegel does not deny this common sense activity at all. He thinks it is the normal way in which we think and work, and should. He adds to it a second layer of philosophical function. Barth and von Kirschbaum ask a set of theological questions. These are questions about whether God is God, and not just a plaything of philosophers and theologians. It would be true that Hegel's claims are bad answers to Barth's questions, but this does not arise. Hegel does not ask, let alone answer, Barth's questions at all. As for Barth and von Kirschbaum, they are probably unable to imagine Hegel's questions in logic, let alone answer them. For all of the boldness of the essay's style, it is a philosophically rather illiterate piece. It is nonetheless important to remember that Barth's lecturing on Hegel is contemporary with the Barmen Declaration of 1934, so we may be able to explain where this error comes from. Consider this. This is from the Barmen Declaration. We publicly declare before evangelical churches in Germany that what they hold in common is grievously imperiled, and with it the unity of the German evangelical church. This threat consists in the fact that the theological basis in which the German evangelical church is united has been continually and systematically thwarted and rendered ineffective by alien principles on the part of the leaders and spokesmen of the German Christians, as well as on the part of the church administration. These are not small matters. They are utterly urgent. It would thus be, surely, strange and wrong for us to dismiss or mock Barth and von Kirschbaum for their misreading of Hegel. They hear in Hegel's own alien principles something that they hear elsewhere in their own time. The problem is that the alien principles in Hegel are logical principles, whereas the alien principles in the Church of the Deutsche Christen are political ones. Political principles are common sense matters. Logical claims are not. Can we defend Barth and von Kirschbaum even further? I think we can. And we should. This reading of Hegel, the one with the four criticisms, was surely quite common at the time Barth was writing. And the influence of such major figures as Kojève, Hippolyte, and others who have transformed our reading of Hegel was only just beginning. Kojève's celebrated lectures on Hegel in Paris date from 1933, almost exactly contemporary with Barth's Bonn lectures, much too early for Barth to be shaped by them. Moreover, the edition of Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion that Barth and von Kirschbaum cite, that's the Lasson edition of the 1920s, is significantly inferior to the scholarly editions we have today. For this lecture I checked the library catalogues in the universities of Münster and Bonn, where Barth was based, and their Hegel holdings from this period are extremely patchy. Even if Barth had wanted to go to the library to consult works, they just were not there. Surely an effect, in part, of the collapsing economy in the Weimar Republic. We need to be attentive to this. So the reading of Hegel I have begun to outline here, a reading in logic, is made possible because of first-rate and affordable critical editions of Hegel and the work of R.G. Collingwood from the 1930s. Neither was available to Barth and von Kirschbaum. It would be absurd to judge them by standards of thinking that depend on those unavailable resources. We simply have to think more historically and thus more charitably. But is that it then? Are we to say that in the end, Hegel, Barth and von Kirschbaum ask different questions, and that Hegel's interpreters are hampered and obstructed both by the paucity of library holdings and thus by their failure to understand Hegel is reading texts about the logical structure of concepts? No. What we have is less a conclusion and more a research proposal. If it is the case, and it is, that Hegel is misread by theologians, if it is the case, and it is, that this misreading arises from a failure to consider technical questions of logic, and if theologians routinely read respectable logical claims as disastrous theological ones, this is the argument of my book on Hegel, then we have both a problem and a solution. Or more exactly, we have two problems requiring two solutions. The first problem is one of interpreting Hegel. There is clearly a need for a commentary on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion that attends properly to technical questions of logic, as well as to the theological landscape that Hegel is traversing. That is a significant philosophical and historical and theological undertaking. I have been most fortunate to have been welcomed here to a professorial post in philosophical theology, and I intend to make good use of it by writing such commentary, although I admit I am intimidated by the scale of the challenge and am conscious that there are probably good reasons why others have not taken it up. It's going to need a big grant. The second problem is that of intellectual formation. Faculties of theology and philosophy are typically separate, even if in Birmingham we're separated by about 2 feet of floor. Just as they were in Barth's and von Kirschbaum's time, the two disciplines have continued on different paths. The University of Berlin created a new, independent faculty of philosophy, the first in the world, I think, thus laying down a challenge to the 3 medieval faculties of theology, law, and medicine. These days, it's less of a big challenge and more of a problem, just as it clearly was for Barth and von Kirschbaum. Theologians who want to understand and interpret Hegel are not well served by an emphatic separation between these disciplines. If you're interested in theology and you want to study Hegel seriously, this will require a solid foundation in theology and in philosophy, including questions of logic. If one starts to imagine the kind of double formation necessary at undergraduate and graduate level, the difficulties become at least easy to enumerate. Reading Hegel requires 3 distinct but related tracks of competence. 2 are obvious. One needs to study German idealism, at least from Kant onwards, and grasp theology sufficiently to grant familiarity with debates about Christology and Trinitarian theology in a long tradition. The third is equally important, but requires strong institutional support and organisation. To understand Hegel, one needs a sure footing in classical Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, and especially the metaphysics. The work of Collingwood, on which this lecture depends, is, for example, undertaken as commentary and development of the Greek tradition, something quite normal in the 1930s, much less normal today, taking along the way account developments in logic in the modern period. It is a challenge to fashion the kind of graduate training that would furnish this kind of facility in philosophy and theology. A challenge, certainly, but by no means impossible. I suppose that this is why universities appoint professors, and I look forward to discovering what can be done here in Birmingham in collaboration with my many able colleagues upstairs in theology and downstairs in philosophy. We shall see. Thank you.